The thunder crashed as Grace Turner stumbled in the mud, her bound wrists raw against the rope that secured her to the wooden fence post. Rain lashed down mercilessly, soaking her thin cotton dress until it clung to her trembling body like a second skin. This was how she would die, abandoned on the outskirts of Silver Creek, Colorado, in the storm of the century, in the year 1879. Grace had been traveling west with a wagon train when everything went horribly wrong. The Harmon brothers, a trio of outlaws who'd infiltrated their group days before, had revealed their true intentions when they were just 2 days from town. They'd killed the wagon master, stolen the group's valuables, and taken Grace as collateral. When she'd fought back and managed to wound the youngest brother with his own knife, they'd decided she wasn't worth the trouble. They'd tied her to this fence on the edge of nowhere and left her to the elements. "Help!" she screamed, her voice drowned by another crash of thunder. The wind whipped her soaked auburn hair across her face, and she tasted salt tears mixing with the rain. At 22 years old, Grace Turner had survived the loss of her parents to influenza, the burning of her family home in Missouri, and a 1,000-mile journey west. She would not die tied to a fence post in Colorado territory. But as the hours passed and the storm showed no sign of abating, hope began to fade. Her fingers had gone numb, and she could no longer feel her feet in her sodden boots. The darkness was almost complete now, broken only by flashes of lightning that illuminated the desolate landscape around her. It was during one such flash that she saw him, a dark silhouette on horseback, appearing like a ghost from the sheets of rain. At first she thought he might be a hallucination, a final cruel trick of her mind before succumbing to the cold. But the figure drew closer, and the horse's hooves splashed in the mud. "Hello," she called, her voice cracking. "Please help me." The rider pulled his horse to a stop. In the next flash of lightning, she caught glimpses of a broad-shouldered man in a long duster, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. "Madam?" His voice was deep, resonant even over the howling wind. He approached cautiously, one hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "What in tarnation?" "The Harmon brothers," Grace explained through chattering teeth. "They robbed our wagon train and left me here to die." The man cursed under his breath. "Those bastards have been terrorizing folks all across the territory." He moved closer, and in another lightning flash, Grace saw a rugged face with several days' worth of beard and eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. "I'm Flynn Keller. I ranch about 5 miles east of here." "Grace Turner," she managed. "Please." The rope. Flynn drew a knife from his boot and quickly sliced through her bindings. The moment she was free, Grace's legs buckled beneath her. Flynn caught her before she hit the ground, strong arms wrapping around her waist. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "Since midday, I think. I've lost track of time." Flynn nodded grimly. "You're half frozen. My ranch is closest. Can you ride?" Grace tried to take a step and stumbled again. "I can't feel my feet." Without another word, Flynn scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. Grace couldn't help but notice the solid strength of his chest as he carried her to his horse. "This is Thunderbolt," he said, lifting her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. "Best horse in the territory. He'll get us home safe." Grace felt Flynn's arms encircle her as he reached for the reins, creating a warm cocoon that shielded her from the worst of the storm. She leaned back against his chest, too exhausted and cold to worry about propriety. "Hold on tight, Miss Turner," Flynn said, his breath warm against her ear. "It's going to be a rough ride." They rode through the deluge, the world around them reduced to shadow and sound. Grace drifted in and out of awareness, anchored only by the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her and the solid presence of the man behind her. At some point, she felt something warm and heavy drape around her shoulders. Flynn's duster, she realized dimly. "Stay with me," he urged when she slumped against him. "Talk to me. Where are you from?" "Missouri," she mumbled, fighting to stay conscious. "St. Joseph." My parents died last winter. I was going to live with my aunt in Sacramento. That's a long way to travel alone. Wasn't alone. Had the wagon train, 15 families. She shivered violently. Until the Harmons, Flynn's arms tightened around her. I've been tracking those 3 for weeks. They hit my neighbor's place last month, took everything they had. Grace wanted to respond, but darkness was closing in around the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered was Flynn's voice, urgent in her ear, telling her to stay awake just a little longer. When she next opened her eyes, she was inside a small but sturdy cabin. A fire roared in the stone hearth, and she was wrapped in several thick blankets on a narrow bed. Her wet clothes had been replaced by a large flannel shirt that hung past her knees and thick wool socks. For a moment, panic flared in her chest at the realization. Mrs. Abernathy from the next property overchanged your clothes, came Flynn's voice from across the room. I fetched her as soon as we arrived. Grace turned her head to see him sitting at her rough-hewn table, cleaning his revolver by the light of an oil lamp. His dark hair was still damp, curling slightly at his neck, and he'd changed into dry clothes, a simple chambray shirt and denims. Without his hat and duster, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 20s. Thank you, she whispered, her throat raw. You saved my life. Flynn looked up, his eyes a startling blue in his weathered face. Anyone would have done the same. No, Grace said with certainty. They wouldn't have. She tried to sit up but found her limbs were still weak and uncooperative. Flynn was at her side in an instant, helping her to a sitting position and arranging pillows behind her back. Easy now, you've been through a lot. Mrs. Abernathy says you're lucky not to have frostbite. How long have I been asleep? About 14 hours. It's just past noon. He retrieved a mug from the stove and brought it to her. Chicken broth. Can you manage? Grace accepted the mug with trembling hands, and Flynn kept his fingers wrapped around hers to steady them. The broth was hot and savory, bringing life back to her body with each sip. The storm's passed, Flynn said, nodding toward the window. But the creek's flooded, the bridge to town is likely washed out. So I'm stranded here, Grace said, a statement rather than a question, for a few days at least. Flynn returned to his chair. Mrs. Abernathy has gone back to her place, but she said she'd return tomorrow with some clothes and things for you. Her daughter's about your size. Grace nodded, taking another sip of broth. I don't know how I'll ever repay you both. No need, Flynn said simply. Out here we look after each other. It's the only way to survive. As her strength gradually returned, Grace took in her surroundings. The cabin was small but well built with 2 rooms. The main space contained the hearth, a table with 4 chairs, a small kitchen area, and a rocking chair near the fire. Through an open door, she glimpsed what must be Flynn's bedroom. The bed she occupied was in the main room, likely meant for guests. How long have you lived here? She asked. 5 years. Flynn reassembled his revolver with practiced efficiency. Came out from Pennsylvania after the war. Wanted open spaces after spending 4 years in trenches and prison camps. You fought for the Union? Flynn nodded. 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry, got captured at Gettysburg and spent 2 years in Andersonville. His face darkened momentarily. When I got out, I couldn't stand to be hemmed in anymore, Grace understood. Though she hadn't experienced war, she knew what it meant to need a fresh start. And you ranch now, cattle mostly. It's not much, but it's mine. There was quiet pride in his voice. What about you? What awaits you in Sacramento? My Aunt Emma, she's my mother's sister. I've never met her, but she wrote after my parents died, offering me a home. Grace stared into her empty mug. I don't have anywhere else to go. Flynn took the mug from her hands. Rest now, we can talk more later. For 3 days, Grace recovered in Flynn's cabin. True to her word, Mrs. Abernathy, a cheerful widow in her 50s, returned with clothes, toiletries, and an endless stream of gossip about the surrounding ranches. She stayed for hours each day, providing a proper chaperone that preserved Grace's reputation. When Mrs. Abernathy wasn't there, Grace found herself watching Flynn as he went about his chores. There was something mesmerizing about the quiet competence with which he moved through his world-mending tack, chopping wood, tending to his small herd. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. On the fourth day, Grace insisted on helping with the cooking. "I can't just lie about while you do everything," she said firmly, tying one of Mrs. Abernathy's aprons around her waist. Flynn raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. They worked side by side preparing a simple stew, and Grace found herself enjoying the domestic routine. It felt right somehow, standing in this kitchen with this quiet, strong man. "Tell me about the Harmon brothers," she said as they ate. "You mentioned you've been tracking them." Flynn's expression hardened. "They showed up about 6 months ago, started small, stealing horses, robbing travelers. Then they got bolder. Hit the general store in Silver Creek, shot the owner when he resisted. He lived barely." He set down his spoon. "Last month they raided the Johnsons' place while I was away helping with a cattle drive. Took everything of value, burned the barn for spite. Mrs. Johnson was 8 months pregnant. The shock sent her into early labor." "Did she and the baby survive?" Grace asked softly. "They did, but it was close." Flynn's eyes met hers. "I've been riding patrol whenever I can spare the time, hoping to catch them. Sheriff in town is offering a reward." "They murdered our wagon master," Grace said, the memory still raw. "Mr. Daniels was a good man, had a family waiting for him in California." She pushed her bowl away. "I managed to stab the youngest one, Wade. I think his name was in the shoulder when they tried to. When he tried to force himself on me." Flynn's knuckles went white around his fork. "That explains why they left you to die. The Harmons don't like being challenged, especially by a woman." "I'd do it again," Grace said fiercely. "I just wish I'd done more damage." Flynn looked at her with newfound respect. "You're a brave woman, Grace Turner." Something warm unfurled in Grace's chest at his words. Not brave, just unwilling to be a victim. That evening, as they sat before the fire, Flynn taught Grace how to clean and load his spare revolver. "If those men are still in the area, you should know how to defend yourself," he explained as he guided her hands through the motions. His fingers were calloused but gentle against hers, and Grace found herself acutely aware of his proximity, of the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him. When she successfully loaded all 6 chambers and spun the cylinder, he smiled, a rare, transformative expression that made her heart skip. "You're a quick study," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "I've always been a good student," she replied, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach. "Though I never imagined needing these particular skills." "The West requires adaptation," Flynn said, taking back the revolver. "It can be harsh, but there's freedom here too. Room to become whoever you want to be." "Is that what you found?" Grace asked. "Freedom?" Flynn stared into the fire. "I found peace, mostly. After the war, I couldn't sleep without hearing the screams of dying men. Out here, under the stars, with just my horse and cattle for company, I finally found quiet." "And now you have me disrupting your quiet," Grace said with a small smile. Flynn's eyes met hers, surprisingly warm. "Some disruptions are worth enduring." The next morning, Mrs. Abernathy arrived with news. "The bridge to town is passable again," she announced as she bustled in with a basket of fresh eggs. "And the stage will be coming through tomorrow, heading west." Grace felt an unexpected pang at the thought of continuing her journey. In less than a week, Flynn Keller's cabin had begun to feel like home in a way no place had since her parents' death. "That's good news," she said, not quite meeting Flynn's eyes. "Indeed it is," Mrs. Abernathy continued cheerfully. "Though I must say, Flynn, your cabin hasn't looked this clean in years. Perhaps you should consider a more permanent arrangement." She winked at Grace, who blushed furiously. "Mrs. Abernathy," Flynn said with exaggerated patience, "don't you have pies to bake or chickens to feed?" The older woman laughed. "I know when I'm not wanted, I'll leave you two to discuss matters." She squeezed Grace's hand. "Think carefully, dear. Sacramento is an awfully long way from Colorado." After she left, an awkward silence fell between Grace and Flynn. He busied himself with the coffee pot while Grace absently straightened the already neat table. "You don't have to leave tomorrow if you're not ready," Flynn finally said, his back still turned to her. "The stage comes through every 2 weeks." Grace's heart leaped. "Are you asking me to stay?" Flynn turned, his expression guarded. "I'm saying you have options. Your aunt doesn't know to expect you on any particular day." "That's true," Grace admitted. "The journey's already taken longer than expected, and you're still recovering." "I feel much better, still." They stared at each other, the unspoken hanging between them. Finally, Grace gathered her courage. "If I were to stay longer, would it be just until the next stage, or is there another possibility you're considering?" Flynn set down the coffee pot and crossed to her in 3 long strides. Standing before her, he seemed to be waging some internal battle. "I've lived alone for 5 years, Grace. I thought that's what I needed, but having you here these past days..." He ran a hand through his hair. "I'm not a man of many words, but I know when something feels right." Grace's breath caught. "And this feels right to you?" "It does." Flynn took her hand, his touch sending warmth up her arm. "I'm not asking you to abandon your plans. Your aunt is expecting you, and you've endured so much to get this far. But perhaps, if you wanted, you might consider Colorado as your destination instead of California." "Are you proposing, Mr. Keller?" Grace asked, a smile playing at her lips despite her pounding heart. "Not exactly," Flynn said with a rare chuckle. "I think we should know each other better before such decisions. But I am proposing you stay longer as my guest, with Mrs. Abernathy continuing as chaperone, and see if what I'm feeling might be mutual." Grace looked around the small cabin that had become her sanctuary, then back to the man who had saved her life. "I think that's a sensible suggestion," she said softly. "And yes, what you're feeling is mutual." The relief on Flynn's face was palpable. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then we'll tell the stage driver you won't be needing passage just yet." As spring turned to summer, Grace found herself settling into life on Flynn's ranch. She wrote to her aunt, explaining her delayed arrival and hinting at the reason. Emma's reply was swift and understanding. She herself had found love unexpectedly as a young woman and never regretted her change of plans. With Mrs. Abernathy's enthusiastic assistance, Grace expanded Flynn's vegetable garden, added curtains to the windows, and brought feminine touches to the cabin that transformed it from a bachelor's quarters to a home. She learned to ride Flynn's gentle mare, Daisy, and accompanied him on shorter trips around the property. In the evenings, they sat on the porch swing he built for her, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Their courtship progressed with careful respect on both sides. Flynn never presumed more than was proper, though the longing in his eyes when they said goodnight sometimes left Grace breathless. They exchanged stories of their pasts, dreams for their futures, and gradually built a foundation of trust and shared understanding. "I never thought I'd find this," Flynn confessed one evening as they walked along the creek that bordered his property. "After Andersonville, I didn't think I had enough left in me to love someone properly." "And now?" Grace asked, her hand tucked in the crook of his arm. Flynn stopped walking and turned to face her. "Now I think perhaps those years of solitude were just preparing me to appreciate what I found when I rode through that storm." He cupped her cheek gently. "May I kiss you, Grace?" Her answer was to rise on tiptoe and press her lips to his. The kiss was tender at first, then deepened with months of restrained longing. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing heavily. "I love you, Grace Turner," Flynn said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I started falling the moment I cut you free from that fence." "I love you too," Grace replied, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "And I don't want to wait any longer. Ask me again, Flynn. Ask me what you've been wanting to ask for weeks now." Flynn took both her hands in his. "Grace Turner, will you marry me? Will you make this ranch our home and build a life with me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "1,000 times yes." They were married in Silver Creek's small church the following Sunday, with Mrs. Abernathy beaming in the front pew and half the county in attendance. The bride wore a simple white dress ordered from Denver, and the groom a new suit that made him look so handsome Grace could barely speak her vows through her smile. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing in the town square. As Flynn whirled her around in a lively reel, Grace caught sight of a wanted poster tacked to the sheriff's notice board. 3 familiar faces stared back at her, the Harmon brothers. For an instant, the memory of that stormy day threatened to overshadow her happiness. Flynn followed her gaze and drew her closer. "They won't hurt you again," he promised. "The sheriff's formed a posse. They'll be brought to justice." "I know," Grace said, focusing on her husband's face instead of the poster. "I'm not afraid anymore, not with you." Later that night, when they were finally alone in the cabin, their cabin now, Flynn carried her across the threshold as effortlessly as he had carried her through the storm. Their coming together as husband and wife was tender and passionate, a culmination of months of growing love. Afterward, as they lay entwined, Grace traced the scars on Flynn's chest, remnants of his time in the Confederate prison camp. "When I was tied to that fence, I thought it was the end," she murmured. "I never imagined it would be the beginning of everything." Flynn kissed her forehead. "Life has strange ways of bringing us where we're meant to be." Summer turned to autumn, and Grace and Flynn settled into married life with contented ease. They expanded the cattle herd, added a room to the cabin, and made plans for the future. Grace taught at Silver Creek's small schoolhouse 3 days a week, bringing books and learning to children who had few opportunities for education. In November, as the first snow dusted the mountains, the Harmon brothers made a fatal error. They attempted to rob the Silver Creek Bank in broad daylight. The sheriff and his deputies were ready, having been warned by a scout who'd spotted the outlaws camping nearby. In the ensuing shootout, 2 of the brothers were killed. Wade Harmon, the youngest, was wounded and captured. Flynn and Grace attended his trial, sitting stoically as the judge sentenced him to hang for multiple murders, including that of the wagon master. Wade spotted Grace in the courtroom and spat in her direction. "You should have died on that fence," he snarled. "Would have if not for your cowboy hero." Grace stood, her back straight and her voice clear. "You're wrong, Mr. Harmon. I'm stronger than you ever understood. Even without Flynn, I would have found a way to survive because that's what women like me do. We endure, we overcome. And we build something beautiful from the ruins men like you leave behind." The courtroom erupted in applause as Wade was dragged away, his face contorted with impotent rage. Outside, Flynn pulled Grace into a fierce embrace. "Have I told you today how remarkable you are?" "Not since breakfast," she teased, though her voice trembled slightly. Facing Wade had required more courage than she'd expected. Flynn kissed her, not caring who saw. "Well, you are remarkable, Mrs. Keller, and I fall more in love with you every day." That night, as they lay in bed listening to the wind whistle around the cabin eaves, Grace shared her secret. "Flynn, I've been waiting to be certain, but I believe we'll need to finish that second bedroom sooner than planned." Flynn propped himself up on one elbow, his eyes searching her face. "Grace, are you saying?" She nodded, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "By my calculations, we'll welcome a little Keller in about 7 months." The joy that transformed Flynn's face was something Grace knew she would remember until her dying day. He gathered her in his arms, laughing and crying all at once, peppering her face with kisses. "A baby," he whispered in wonder. "Our baby." "The first of several, I hope," Grace said, smiling through her own tears. "As many as you want," Flynn promised. "We'll fill this ranch with children and laughter and love." As winter settled over the Colorado foothills, Grace and Flynn prepared for the next chapter of their lives. Flynn worked tirelessly to finish the nursery, crafting a cradle from pine and painting the walls a cheerful yellow. Grace sewed tiny garments in the evenings while Flynn read aloud from books they hoped to share with their children someday. They celebrated Christmas with a small tree cut from their own land, decorated with paper stars and strings of cranberries. Flynn gave Grace a locket containing a lock of his hair, meant to eventually hold a snippet from their baby as well. Grace gave Flynn a hand-knitted scarf and the news that she had invited her Aunt Emma to visit in the spring. "I want our child to know all of their family," she explained. "And I want Emma to see how happy you've made me." Flynn kissed her soundly. "She's welcome here anytime. This is your home, Grace. Your family is my family now." The winter months passed in peaceful domesticity. Grace's body changed, growing round with the precious life inside her. Flynn watched these changes with reverent wonder, his hands gentle on her swelling belly as he felt their child move. "What shall we name this little cowboy or cowgirl?" he asked one evening as they sat before the fire. Grace smiled. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after my father Daniel." "Daniel Keller," Flynn tested the name. "Strong name for a strong boy." "And if it's a girl," Grace continued, "perhaps Margaret after your mother." Flynn's eyes softened. "She would have loved you, you know, almost as much as I do." When spring arrived, bringing wildflowers and new calves to the ranch, Emma Turner arrived on the stage from Sacramento. She was a tall, elegant woman in her 50s, with Grace's auburn hair now streaked with silver. She embraced her niece with tears in her eyes. "Look at you," she said, holding Grace at arm's length. Positively glowing with happiness and impending motherhood, Grace introduced Flynn, who bowed politely over Emma's hand. "It's an honor to meet you, madam. Grace has told me so much about you." "And she's written volumes about you, Mr. Keller," Emma replied with a warm smile. "I confess I was disappointed when she first wrote that she wouldn't be continuing to California, but now I see she made the right choice. This is clearly where she belongs." Over the next 2 weeks, Emma became part of their household. She and Grace pored over old family recipes, sewed baby clothes, and shared stories of Grace's mother. Flynn took her on tours of the ranch, showing her the improvements they'd made and their plans for the future. "You've built something special here," Emma told them both over dinner one evening. "Something that would make your parents proud, Grace." On a warm June day, with summer settling over the land, Grace went into labor. Emma and Mrs. Abernathy attended her while Flynn paced anxiously outside the bedroom door. After 14 hours of labor, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry. "Flynn," Grace called weakly, "come meet your daughter." He entered the room with reverent steps, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in Grace's arms. Margaret Emma Keller had her mother's auburn hair and her father's blue eyes. When Flynn held her for the first time, his hands trembling slightly, the baby wrapped her tiny fingers around his thumb. "She's perfect," he whispered, tears tracking unashamedly down his cheeks. "Absolutely perfect." As summer turned to autumn once more, marking a year since their wedding, Grace sat on the porch swing with little Maggie sleeping against her shoulder. The setting sun bathed the ranch in golden light, illuminating Flynn as he rode in from checking the herd. He dismounted with the same fluid grace she'd first noticed that stormy night, though now the sight filled her with comfortable familiarity rather than desperate hope. "How are my girls?" he asked, climbing the porch steps and dropping a kiss on Maggie's head before claiming Grace's lips. "We're wonderful," Grace replied, shifting to make room for him on the swing. "Just watching the sunset and counting our blessings." Flynn settled beside them, one arm around Grace's shoulders, the other hand gently stroking Maggie's back. "I was thinking about that day," he said quietly. "The day I found you." "So was I," Grace admitted. "How close we came to never having this." Flynn's arm tightened around her. "I've never been a particularly religious man, but I can't help feeling there was something more than chance at work that night. Of all the fences in Colorado territory, you were tied to one on my regular patrol route." "Divine providence," Grace suggested. "Or perhaps just extraordinarily good fortune. Either way, I'm grateful." Flynn pressed his lips to her temple. "Every morning I wake up beside you, every time I hold our daughter, I'm grateful." Grace turned her face up to his, love swelling in her chest until she thought it might overflow. "Do you know what today is?" Flynn smiled. "1 year since you made me the happiest man in Colorado territory, and you made me the happiest woman," Grace replied. "Though I must say being left tied to a fence in a storm was not how I expected to meet my future husband." Flynn laughed softly. "Life rarely follows the path we expect. Sometimes it leads us through storms to show us the sunshine waiting on the other side." As the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Flynn and Grace Keller sat on their porch swing, their sleeping daughter between them, surrounded by the ranch they had built together. From desperate beginnings on a stormy night had grown a love as vast and enduring as the western landscape itself, a love that would weather whatever storms lay ahead, stronger for having been forged in adversity. "I love you, Flynn Keller," Grace whispered as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Now and always." "And I love you, Grace Keller," Flynn replied, sealing his words with a tender kiss. "Until the stars fall from the sky." 5 years passed, bringing changes to the Keller ranch. The single-room cabin had expanded to a proper house with 4 bedrooms, a study, and a large kitchen where Grace presided over family meals. The cattle herd had tripled in size, making Flynn one of the most successful ranchers in the county. A sturdy barn stood where once there had been only a lean-to, and a vegetable garden flourished under Grace's careful tending. Maggie, now 5, had been joined by 3-year-old Daniel and 1-year-old twins, Emma and Thomas. The ranch echoed with children's laughter and the everyday chaos of family life. On the anniversary of the day Flynn had found Grace tied to the fence, they always took time to remember. It had become a family tradition, a day to reflect on how their lives had intertwined through what seemed like chance but felt like destiny. This year, they rode together to the spot where it had happened. The old fence was still there, though weathered and leaning now. Flynn lifted Maggie onto his horse while Grace secured Daniel on hers, the twins staying home with Mrs. Abernathy, who had become like a grandmother to the children. "This is where I found your mother," Flynn told the children as they dismounted near the fence. It was storming something fierce, lightning all around, rain coming down in sheets. "Were you scared, Mama?" Maggie asked, her blue eyes so like her father's wide with wonder at the often-told tale. Grace smiled, remembering. "I was terrified, sweetheart. But then your father appeared like a hero from a storybook, and I knew everything would be all right. I cut her free and carried her home," Flynn continued, winking at Grace. "Best decision I ever made." "And then you got married and lived happily ever after," Daniel concluded with the certainty of a child who had heard the story many times. "We're still living it," Grace corrected gently, taking Flynn's hand. "Our happily ever after gets better every day." Flynn squeezed her fingers, the years of hard work evident in his calloused palm. "That it does, Mrs. Keller, that it does." As they prepared to mount up and return home, a rider appeared on the horizon. As he drew closer, Grace recognized Sheriff Williams from Silver Creek. "Keller," the sheriff called, tipping his hat to Grace and the children. "Thought I might find you out this way today. Got some news I figured you'd want to hear." "What news is that, Sheriff?" Flynn asked, lifting Daniel onto his horse. "Wade Harmon escaped from prison last month," the sheriff said, his expression grim. "Been tracking him across 3 territories." Grace felt a chill despite the warm autumn sun. Wade had been transferred to a prison in Wyoming after attempting to escape from the Silver Creek jail before his hanging. His sentence had been commuted to life imprisonment, a fact that had never sat well with those who'd suffered at the Harmon brothers' hands. "Is he headed this way?" Flynn asked, moving protectively closer to his family. "Was," the sheriff corrected. "Posse caught up with him yesterday near the Montana border. He won't be troubling anyone ever again." Grace released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you for letting us know, Sheriff. Figured you deserved to hear it, considering what that snake did to you." The sheriff tipped his hat again. "You folks have a good day now." As the sheriff rode away, Flynn turned to Grace. "You all right?" Grace looked at her husband, still handsome after 6 years together, a few strands of silver now threading through his dark hair, and at their beautiful children. The specter of Wade Harmon had never truly haunted her, not after she'd found safety and love in Flynn's arms, but knowing he was gone for good felt like the closing of a chapter. "I'm more than all right," she assured him. "I have everything I could ever want right here." That evening, after the children were asleep, Flynn and Grace sat on their porch swing, a quilt draped over their laps against the autumn chill. The ranch stretched before them, peaceful in the moonlight. "Do you ever wonder where you'd be if I hadn't found you that night?" Flynn asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. "Sometimes," Grace admitted. "I might have made it to Sacramento eventually, might have met someone else, had a different life." "Do you regret it? The path your life took?" Grace turned to him, cupping his beloved face in her hands. "Not for a single moment. Everything I am, everything we've built together, it's more than I ever dreamed possible. You saved me in more ways than just cutting me free from that fence, Flynn Keller." Flynn captured her hands and kissed her palms. "And you saved me too, Grace, from loneliness. From the ghosts of my past. You gave me a family when I'd resigned myself to solitude." "We saved each other," Grace corrected softly, "and we'll keep on doing so every day for the rest of our lives." As the years continued to pass, the story of how Flynn Keller had found Grace Turner tied to a fence in a storm became legend in Silver Creek. Their children grew tall and strong, raised with their father's sense of honor and their mother's compassion. The Keller ranch prospered, a testament to hard work, determination, and the power of love to transform lives. Grace never forgot that stormy night when hope had seemed lost, when her future had hung by the slenderest of threads. In her darkest moments, she had found the strength to call out one last time, and Flynn had answered. From that desperate beginning had grown everything that mattered: family, home, love that only deepened with the passing years. Sometimes, when storms rolled across the Colorado foothills, Grace and Flynn would stand together on their porch, watching lightning flash across the distant mountains. In the fury of nature, they found a strange comfort, a reminder of the night that had brought them together and the strength they had discovered in each other. "Some storms bring destruction," Flynn would say, his arm secure around his wife's waist, "and some bring miracles." Grace would lean into his embrace, grateful beyond words for the cowboy who had cut her free and carried her home, for the life they had built from that moment of rescue, and for the love that continued to shelter them through all of life's storms. "The greatest miracle of all," she would reply, her heart full to overflowing, "is finding the person who makes anywhere feel like home." And Flynn would kiss her then, as tenderly as he had on their wedding day, sealing a promise that had begun in rain and thunder and would endure until the end of their days, a promise of love, unwavering and true, as vast as the western sky and as enduring as the mountains that stood sentinel over their ranch. For Grace and Flynn Keller, happily ever after wasn't just a fairy tale ending. It was a daily choice, a continuing journey, and the greatest adventure either of them had ever known, an adventure that had begun when a cowboy found a woman tied to a fence in a storm and recognized, even then, that his life would never be the same again.